Today we get to step into chapter 2 in this story. And I'm excited about this. I'm excited we're just a couple weeks into a long series, but it's a series where we get to explore the Bible in depth and in great detail. And that's exciting to me, and I hope it's exciting to you as well. I have a question for you as we begin today. Have you ever tried to put together a puzzle when you've been missing the cover? Has anybody ever tried that? Tried to put together, there's one, not on purpose, halfway through and the cover goes missing? Is that what happened? Sometimes we try to put together a puzzle and we find that there's a missing piece, right? If you have kids at home, you usually can figure out what happened to it. It disappeared somewhere along the line. But how many of you have ended up putting together a whole puzzle and found that there was a missing piece somewhere in that puzzle? And how does that make you feel? Like incomplete, right? Like you just want to finish, and it never can be finished. That missing piece is what's there. This week we're going to look at a piece of God's story. So if you think of the whole Bible as being the full puzzle, the full picture, every time that we meet each week, we're going to add another piece to that picture, add another piece of the puzzle to what is God's story, and hopefully see how we fit into that story as well. Because the Bible itself is a pretty big book. When we look at what we have here, it's 66 books, it's 1,089 chapters. It's a whole lot of words, and there's different ways that it's been, translations that it's come into us as well. But we want to see how the different pieces of the story fit into the whole picture over the coming weeks. And so we're going to step through it in chronological order, using the story as the tool that helps us to understand our Bible a little bit better. You have to understand the story is not to replace your Bible. It's just to help us understand it a little bit better, putting the stories into the order that they happened instead of into the way that they're compiled in the Bibles that we keep in our homes and carry in our hands and that you find in the pew. Every week we're going to read from the story, a corresponding chapter that we'll talk about Sunday. And then if you're able to be involved in Sunday school or one of the small groups, then we talk about that a little deeper as well in the story, in the small group sessions at that time. So today we talk about chapter 2. If you want to read ahead for next week, you would read chapter 3 this week, and that would prepare you for next week's sermon as we'll move on to chapter 3 next week. But I want you to think of it that way today, as in the way the picture of a puzzle. And there's actually, it's a unique phrase, but we've talked about it different ways. We've talked about the upper story, right? When I come over here and talk about God's story or God's grand design, the mural that He's created, the mural is like that whole puzzle put together, all of the pieces. All of the lower stories that we're going to talk about, they're the pieces of the puzzle that fit into that grand design, into that grand story that's up there. And then there's my story, how my story fits into that as well. Last week, we talked about these different things together, and I explained the upper story, the lower story, and my story. So that upper story is God's sovereignty, God pursuing mankind, how He loved people, how He provided for us, the grand mural that He has made, the full puzzle. The lower story is the historical context, the mysteries of mankind, how we were separated from God, the questions of life that we may have, those all take place in the lower story. And then we also have my story, which is the application to our life. Where does my story resemble the lower story and connect with God's story as well? Last week we jumped in with the first movement, which was the story of creation and the fall of man, or the story of the garden, as we put it together. And that happened way back here, as late ago as 10,000 BC, is what we understand, the creation of the earth, and then the fall, and also the flood that happened, Noah's story we talked about briefly last week. And that was all in chapter 1. Today we move into the second movement, the story of Israel, which starts in Genesis chapter 12, is the story of Israel. From about 2100 BC on, we see the life of Abraham and all of his descendants. And it's when God comes up with a way to bring Jesus into the story. And we'll see this overarching picture and weaving throughout as God prepares His people for a way to ultimately introduced Jesus, and then the creation of the church in the third story, or the fourth story, and then the story of the new garden at the end as well. And when the tree of life comes back and when everything is restored to the way God originally intended it to be. Last week was one piece of that puzzle with the creation and also the reason for the suffering that we have in the world. And today we get to look at a second piece of that puzzle. I want to highlight, though, if you weren't here last week, just a couple of the things that are important to the story today for us. We remember from chapter 1 that God created and it was good. He created men and women after the creation of the world. In Ephesians, the Apostle Paul tells us that he created all of the world in order to create man and woman. And when they were created in God's image, he says that it was very good. Everything that he had done was now very good. And during that time, early in the garden, God walked with us, and we were in a relationship with him together. We had freedom, and we had free will to do what we chose. There was only one thing that God asked, is that they would not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They had access to everything else, including the tree of life, and they had access to God in person as well. But we know as we read that story, or we may have heard the story, that we chose to go our own way and try our own thing. That there was a serpent who came and tempted Eve, and Eve and Adam both ate from that tree, and the world has been changed ever since. Because of that sin, that disobedience to God, they were removed from the garden so that they could not have access to the tree of life, because God knew that that's not how he wanted mankind to live. Not with that sin in their lives. He wanted a freedom to choose, but also to understand the difference between living with him and living without him. And because of that sin and the fact that we could no longer be in the garden, he removed them from the garden, and there were also consequences to their actions, where the world that we live in and our relationships with both the plants and animals and with one another became broken as a result of that sin. But God didn't want to leave us there in that broken place. He wanted to restore our relationship. And we talked about a few different instances where we see hints of that, foreshadowing of what God ultimately wanted to do to be able to restore our relationship with him. In Genesis 3, he talked about how there would be one who would crush the serpent that would come from the offspring of woman, of Eve. And a foreshadowing of what Jesus would do. We see foreshadowing in the stories that we read of Cain and Abel, as well as in the flood story, foreshadowing of a time when all would be restored and all would be made new. And God had a plan. He had an overarching upper story that he wanted to work within the lives of people, within the lives of his creation, to restore us to what he originally designed us for. And so as we see that introduction to the story in the chapter 1 of the story, we see the introduction to sin and to God, who is our main character. And the rest of this story is God working at restoring our relationship back with him. And so we'll see that here in the building of a nation, or the story of Israel, as we begin to work back towards that. I want to give you a short highlight video that introduces chapter 2 to you if you haven't had a chance to read it, but it gives you an overview of what happens in chapter 2. Let's watch this video together.
There once was a man named Abram, who was a descendant of Noah. God told him to move with his wife Sarai, an entire family, away from where they lived. God made a promise: I will make you into a great nation and bless you, and all of the people on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram and his family left. At one point, they stopped, and God told him to look around. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your children. Then, one night, God took Abram outside. Look up and count the stars. This is the number of children you will have. But Abram was already 75 years old, and Sarai was way too old to have children. So they decided that Sarai's servant Hagar should have Abram's child. Hagar became pregnant and gave birth to a son named Ishmael. Yet God told Abram again, "You will be the father of many nations." God changed their names to Abraham and Sarah and promised that it would be through Sarah that God's blessing would come. Exactly as God promised, Sarah became pregnant, giving birth to a son named Isaac. When Isaac was still a young boy, God told Abraham to take his son up on a mountain and sacrifice him. Abraham took Isaac, laid him on an altar, and took out his knife to kill him. But an angel stopped Abraham, and God provided a ram to sacrifice in place of Isaac. Years later, Abraham and Sarah died and left everything they owned to Isaac. Isaac married and had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau was Isaac's favorite, and as the oldest, he was set to gain his father's inheritance. But Jacob wanted the inheritance, so he came up with a scheme to trick his father, who was now old and blind, into promising it to him. He dressed in Esau's clothes and put animal skin on his hands because Esau's hands were very hairy. Confused, Isaac gave his blessing to Jacob and promised him the inheritance instead of Esau. This caused a huge fight, one that almost ended in murder before they went their own ways. Thankfully, they reunited, and God promised to bless Jacob's family. Jacob had 12 sons of his own. And like his father and grandfather before him, Jacob had a favorite son. Little did Jacob know that his favoritism would put his son, Joseph, in danger of being killed by his own brothers.
That, in essence, is the story of chapter 2, the story that we read within the book, the story. And there are a lot of different puzzle pieces that we could choose to talk about this morning within that story. We could talk about Abraham, we could talk about Lot, we could talk about the women involved like Sarah and Hagar, the servant. We could talk about the sons that come of Jacob and then of his sons and their sons as well. But today we want to focus just on one person, and that's the person of Abraham. We're going to look at his life in detail from these chapters in the book of Genesis. Abraham is a major character because this is who God made some promises to about the creation of the nation, of the creation of Israel, and the things that would happen because of this creation of a new nation at that time. Abraham actually has more chapters written about him than the whole creation of the world. There are 13 chapters where Abraham's story is told, and he's mentioned 75 times in the New Testament in reference to what happened to him and to his life. He's an important person to know. He's first known as Abram, and his wife is known as Sarai. But God would form a covenant with them, and at that point of the formation of the covenant, he changed their names, as was common to Abraham and to Sarah. In Genesis chapters 10 and 11, just before Abraham's story, we didn't talk about it, but what those chapters do is they show the lineage of what happened. It's kind of a history of mankind from the time of Noah, when the ark landed and the flood waters began to recede, up until the time of Abraham, and it shows the lineage that happened. And it actually takes about 1,000 years for chapters 10 and 11 to happen before Abraham is born, and before this story begins to take place. And Genesis 12 is the start of this story. It's the start of Abraham's story. I want to read to you what happens there. Some of it will show up on your screen, but you can turn there as well to page 13 in the story. Or if you have your Bible with you, turn with me to Genesis chapter 12, and we're going to read verses 1 to 3. In this part of Genesis, I'll read with you. It says, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the people on earth will be blessed through you. And then just a few pages later in Genesis 15, there's another statement that God makes. He took Abraham outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars. If indeed you can count them," then he said to him, "so shall be your offspring." Basically, as numerous as the stars, this is the offspring that you will have. In these verses, we get to see the introduction of Abraham into the story, into God's story, and the introduction of what he planned to do through Abraham. In those first verses in chapter 12, he made a promise to him. He said to him, leave your country and your people and your father's household and go to the land I will promise you. For I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the people on earth will be blessed through you. This is God's plan, was to take Abram and turn him into a great nation. And we know, because we get to see the rest of the story, right? That happened back here. And for the next 1,500 years, this nation, and even up till today, it continues to grow and continues to change. But in God's story, it started here with Abraham and his descendants and his followers. And exactly what God promised, he did. He accomplished. It came true. Abraham's little piece, his little puzzle piece, fit into God's story in a great way. But when we first read this, that God is going to build a nation through Abraham, we understand that there are some problems with this. Why would he choose Abraham out of all the people that he could have chose from at that point in time? When you look at it a little bit later in the story in Joshua chapter 24, we learn that Abraham's father, Terah, was actually an idol worshiper. He was far from God, and in fact, he wasn't just an idol worshiper. He created the idols. He made them for other people in their households to worship. And so God chose the son of an idol worshiper and his wife. And not only did he choose the son of an idol worshiper, he chose an infertile couple who were the children of idol worshipers, in order to build his new nation of people that would worship him, and through them, God would be made known to the world. When we look at this, and often when we look at many things, we wonder, why would God choose to do this? Why would he choose Abraham? Why would you choose this couple to build a nation? The story tells us that they were already old, that they were infertile, that they weren't the most likely people to be chosen, but yet God chose them. In my mind, if I was planning to build a nation of people and build a nation of descendants, I would have looked around and chose, that young couple over there who are full of life. They're out, playing games, they're out involved, and they're vibrant, and they have many, many years ahead of them. Instead, Abraham looks over, and one pastor I heard speak about it, he said, instead God looks over and he chooses that couple over there, the one with the walkers, the infertile couple. That's the couple he chose to start a nation from their lineage and from their heritage. Abraham was at least 75 when God called him to leave his country and everything that he knew and go off and start something completely different. And Sarah wasn't much younger. They were the least likely couple. God chose this elderly, infertile couple to populate a nation. He said, I'm going to use them, and I'm going to use them to tell a story. God, as we follow through his story and look at all of the lower stories, look at all of the different little puzzle pieces, we'll see that again and again throughout Scripture, God chooses the least likely individuals to be at the heart of his story. So he chose Abraham and Sarah, who were infertile. A little bit later, he chooses Moses to be his mouthpiece, to be his voice before Pharaoh, someone who doesn't like to speak, who actually ran away and hid for 4 decades in the desert. He chooses him. He chooses David, who had some strengths, but he also had some weaknesses. He chooses prophets who were quiet, who ran away from what he wanted to do. He chooses apostles in the New Testament who were on opposite ends of the spectrum. Some were rebellious rebels, and some were quiet and meek, and some were young, and some were old. He chooses Paul to go tell the world about Jesus. outside of the Jewish world, and he's someone who's sick and deals with health problems. Again and again throughout Scripture, God chooses the least likely, not who you would expect, but he also tells us why he does that. Why choose them is he chooses them because he wants his name to be made known. He wants glory to be brought to him, not to the individuals that are involved. And so often in these situations, like with Abraham and Sarah, he says, I'm choosing you so that no one can say that you did this on your own, that this is my work, this is my plan, and this is my story that I want to tell through you. It's not because you have it all together. It's not because you have all the right stuff, but it's because of me and my work and my life and what I am going to do in you and through you. He chooses the least likely so that glory may be brought to him and to his story, to the upper story. He chooses those that he can work through so that his glory will be made known and his strength will shine. And so in today's story, it's about a nation that will be built using this elderly, infertile couple. And when he did that, then in doing that, he wanted to show the world who he was. I encourage you to think about your life as we think about this story as well, that God builds and uses us, our puzzle pieces, and sometimes our broken lives to fit into his story in new ways, where God says, watch what I can do with you if you would only let me. We too can be part of God's masterpiece in the same way, where he will use our puzzle pieces to fit into his grand design, into his grand mural. Sometimes we just need to step out in faith and trust him. And I know that this is a hard thing to do, but this is what the story of Abraham is all about. The first thing that we notice as we read this story is that faith is obeying God when you don't know where you're going. It's the first thing we notice. Faith is obeying God even when you don't know where you're going. And that's the first part of the passage that we read. He says, leave your country, and he says, into the land that I will show you. Go to the land that I will show you. You've never been there. You don't know where it is. But I want you to leave your country, take your wife and your possessions, and go, and I will show you when you get there. And then the very next verse, in verse 4, says, so Abraham left. He did exactly what God asked him to do, moving all of his possessions, leaving everything that he knew behind for a new place and a new land. Later, when the author of the book of Hebrews in the New Testament was writing about faith and these stories of faith that are found throughout the Old Testament, he wrote this about Abraham. It's in Hebrews 11, verse 8. It says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. And this was the mark of faith, the sign of the faith that Abraham had. Abraham did exactly what God asked him to do. He obeyed and he went, even though he had no clue where he was going. If we put that into our perspective in our own lives, how hard would that be, wouldn't it? To pick up and leave everything behind just on faith. But that's what he did. He said, go, you don't know where, but I promise to build you into a great nation. And so Abraham left. A little later in chapter 15, we read that he said, I will make you as populous as the stars in the sky, is what he promised Abraham. That was after the incident with Sarah's handmaiden, with Hagar. He came back and he said, no, that's not the story that I want to tell. I don't want it to be about a son that is with Hagar. I want it to be a story about a son that is with Sarah. So Abraham and Sarah got ahead of themselves a little bit, and they tried to help God out in this story. But God said, no, this isn't what my plan is. My plan is for you and Sarah to have children. And so if you read through it, you'll realize that they were actually closer to 100. About 15 years had passed by the time that their son was born. And after God says this, takes him out and shows him the stars in the sky, again, it says that Abraham believed God and took him on his word. And then it was sometime later that their son was born after that. So faith is obeying God even when you don't know where you're going. Faith is also about believing God against all hope. It's about believing God against all hope. In Genesis 15, it says that Abraham believed in the Lord, even though there was really no hope of this happening. There was no earthly reason for Abraham and Sarah to have children at this time and at their age. But against all odds, Abraham believed in God and trusted in him. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 4, he says this. He says, against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations. Just as it had been said to him, so shall your offspring be. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had the power to do whatever he promised. Against all hope, Abraham believed, even though they were both in that age range. Even though Abraham was 100 years old, he said, if this is what God has promised, this is what's going to happen. And you can believe that probably people were looking around at them, and if they had told anyone and said, this isn't going to happen, how is that likely? Is God going to make this happen? It doesn't make any sense. But Abraham believed against all hope, against all common sense. See, faith is also obeying God when you don't know where you're going, but it's also obeying God when there seems to be no hope, or believing when there seems to be no hope. See, your story, your faith comes down to that same question. Do you believe? When you don't get that job, when things don't go the way you want, when life gets hard, or when life gets easy, or when you experience loss or pain or trials, do you believe that you're still within the story of God? Do you believe that God is still there, that he is still good, that he loves you, and that he cares for you? See, faith is not believing that God will do whatever I want him to do, or whatever I ask him to do, as long as I hope enough or pray enough or believe enough. Sometimes we confuse that as being faith, when faith is actually believing that God will do what he said he would do in our lives and in the life of our family and our community and in the world. Faith is about believing what God said he would do, not believing that he'll do what I want him to do. And Abraham and Sarah got ahead of God. They take things into their own hands with the handmaid Hagar, but then they turn around and begin to trust in him, that God would do what he said he would do, which leads to our third point, that faith is trusting in God even when the story doesn't make sense. Faith is trusting in God even when the story doesn't make sense. I want to read, if you flip with me to Genesis chapter 22. This isn't going to show up on the screen this morning. We're going to read a number of verses from here, and I encourage you to follow along with me if you're able, or just listen to these words. But it's a story that happens later after the birth of his son, Isaac. We believe Isaac is about 15 years old at this time when this story takes place. And it's a story that many of us may have heard, but one that we also question. In Genesis chapter 22, verse 1, it says this. It says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. This is what God told Abraham to do. So the same Abraham who left his land and headed off to an unknown land, the same one who believed that he would have a child with Sarah even though they were 100 years old, and it happened. 15 years later, at 115, he had one son, and that was this son, Isaac, with Sarah. And God said, I want you to now take the son and go to this mountain and sacrifice him there. This is, you must understand, completely contrary to the character of God, and that's why many of us question it. See, never once in the Bible does God command or ask someone to do this. In fact, in Deuteronomy, he gives commands against the sacrifice of people. So why would this be? Why would this story be here? Why would God ask Abraham to do that? And we get the privilege of reading this story after it's happened and after we have seen the character and history of God. And so it actually tells us right in the text in those first verses in Genesis 22, verse 1, where it says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. God tested him. It was a test that God gave to Abraham, and he obeyed. In verse 3 of chapter 22, we'll read a little further. It says, early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I go with the boy over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Notice that very last verse. As he went, this is what he said to his servants, or stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go up over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. He knew what he was supposed to do, right? He had took the wood for the offering. He had taken his son as God had asked him to, and he was going by faith, still believing that God would somehow use him and somehow use his son to build a nation. Even though God had asked him to sacrifice this one and only son that he had, he believed that he would come back along with his son, that we would be back to the servants. It's important to see this. See that sometimes the lower story, however, doesn't always make sense without understanding the upper story of what's going on. In Hebrews chapter 11, as they're talking about faith again, a few verses later, they bring up this passage. And the author writes this. He says, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned, that they will grow. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. That's what the author of Hebrews writes about this story. See, the lower story sometimes doesn't make sense without understanding the upper story. And that's what Abraham believed. He believed that there was part of God's story that he was still going to be used for, that somehow he would come out the other side of this experience, and that him and Isaac would walk back to their home together. And that's what faith is. Faith is trusting in God even when the story doesn't make sense. I want to read to you what happens as they go up this hill. In Genesis 22, verse 6, it says, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham. It said to his father, Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything with him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld your son from me, your only son. A couple of things to note. When it says, now that I know you will not withhold anything from me. The angel of the Lord that appeared was obviously God in person that showed up there. Because it says, you did not withhold him from me. So God showed up after this test or during this test and saw that Abraham, even though it didn't make sense, even though the story seemed incomplete, he trusted in him, he had faith in him, and he didn't withhold his one and only son. He took him up to that region in Mount Moriah. And something I found as I was researching this passage this week that I found very interesting. Last week we talked about the foreshadowing of what God would do in the days ahead as he took his son up into this region and left his servants behind. It was a few days' walk from where they were and went up to this mountain in the region of Mount Moriah. We need to understand that this is the exact same region where 2,000 years later, Jesus himself was crucified as God's one and only Son. In Chronicles, it tells us that the temple itself was built in this same region of mountains. It was built in this same place. And on one of those mountains, Abraham walked up and built an altar to sacrifice his only son. And a couple thousand years later, Jesus was taken up onto one of those mountains and was sacrificed as God's one and only Son. The Old Testament and a number of places, they put this together that this same region is exactly where this took place. Both of these stories are together. I think there was some foreshadowing that God was showing people that this would need to take place at some point in the future. And that probably all of the pieces to the puzzle fell together when Jesus was sacrificed and conquered his death years later in that same place and in that same region. In verses 13 and 14, he goes a little further. He says, Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram and caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as the burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On that mountain the Lord it will be provided." When we think about these stories and we think about the life of Abraham, we need to realize that he didn't have an instruction manual with him. All he had was the voice of God calling him, to step forward in these different ways, and he listened and obeyed. How many of you have a book like this at home somewhere? So this one is specifically on flooring, but it's a home handyman book. I actually have several. I forgot it this morning, and this is the one that Jamie brought to me, but I have some that are for wiring, some that are for flooring. But inside, there's all kinds of helpful pictures, right? To help you. Any of you have books like this at home? Or is it just me who tries to play in this way? But when you look at it, there's all kinds of pictures and all kinds of instructions, and I'm a person who I like to read. And so I've looked through the books, I've flipped through them, I've read. I'll read the instructions before I start a project to try to understand better how to accomplish that project and do it. But if all we ever do is look at the book and read it or put it on our shelf, it doesn't actually help us accomplish anything, does it? How many of you have books like this on your shelf that you've never actually used? There's a few hands, right? You have to actually put it into practice in your life and follow through with it. Nothing will be fixed in your house without actually taking action. You can read it. I guess the newest thing would be not a book, but looking it up on YouTube and watching somebody repair this or do that and learning how it's done. But unless you actually go out there and take the action to follow through with it, nothing will be fixed, will it? Reading all that you can, understanding all that you can, watching all that you can doesn't help you actually accomplish anything. So remember that missing puzzle piece from our puzzles at the beginning that we talked about? I want you to think of the grand mural that God created, the upper story that's happening. This mural that spreads across time and place and extends even up till today. Within that mural, there are all kinds of stories and all kinds of pictures of what happens in the world. All kinds of stories like Abraham's story and Isaac's story and Noah's story and Moses' story and Paul's story. But there's also your story and there's also my story that fit into that plan, that fit into that mural, that fit into his story. And we can read about it all we want. We can begin to understand God's story and his plan for life. But unless we take action and unless we engage, it's just like the home handyman book that we keep on our shelf, that it doesn't really amount to much except to gather dust. I would like to say that I believe that as we go through this journey, we will see that God uses people just like us, imperfect, impractical people. When I think of being here even for the past 10 years or being called to be a pastor, it's by God's grace that I'm here. It's not because of any gift that I have of my own, but it's because he called me to be here and he's gifted me to be here for this time and for this place and for his purposes here. And it's the same for you. And I don't know what God may be calling you into or what he may be asking you to do or what you're already doing that fits into that mural. Because I know that many of you are engaged and involved in so many different ways that your puzzle piece fits into that grand mural of God in an amazing way. But we need to realize that we need to take the book, we need to open it, and we need to live it out. So my questions for us today are this. Could you be the missing puzzle piece to God's masterpiece? Could you be that missing puzzle piece that fits into the story in some way? Remember, it's not about your abilities, it's about God's call on your life. And so today, as we go, think about these things. Do you have faith? When you don't know where God is taking you, do you have faith like Abraham did? Are you willing to step out like he did? Or when all odds are against what God is calling you to do you have faith in what he's calling you to do? It was very unlikely that Abraham and Sarah would ever have children or that a great nation would come from them. But they stepped out and they believed in faith. And do you have faith when it just doesn't make sense? It doesn't make sense for Abraham to go up on the mountain and sacrifice his only son when that son is supposed to be the start of a huge nation and a huge heritage. But Abraham stepped forward in faith and believed that God could do whatever he asked him to do, that God would be at work through it. And I think the same is true for each of us, that we could be that missing puzzle piece, just like Abraham was the puzzle piece at that time, that there's something that God could be asking us to do. So my question is, do you have faith to follow? I'm going to invite the worship team to come up and lead us in our last song this morning.